December 16th, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. 3,000 German guns open fire before dawn, and the American soldiers in their path are about to face the largest offensive Germany has launched in the West since 1940. At 0530 hours, without any of the warning signs that Allied intelligence had been trained to look for. No significant build-up detected, no unusual radio traffic, no aerial reconnaissance indicating the concentration of armor that is now deployed along a 60-mile front from Monschau in the north to Echternach in the south. The artillery opens. The barrage is not surgical. It is designed to saturate. It falls on American command posts, artillery positions, signal centers, and infantry foxholes simultaneously. A wall of steel and concussion arriving without warning in the pre-dawn darkness. In weather so cold that the men in those foxholes have been managing a different kind of survival for weeks. The 8th Corps of the United States First Army holds this sector, approximately 83,000 men, stretched across a line that military doctrine says requires twice that number to adequately defend. The divisions holding it include the 4th Infantry Division, battered from the Hürtgen Forest, the 28th Infantry Division, equally worn from the same fighting, the 106th Infantry Division, newly arrived in theatre and not yet combat-hardened, and the 99th Infantry Division, in its first weeks of frontline service. Against them, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt has assembled 28 divisions, 3 full armies, including the 6th Panzer Army under SS Oberstgruppenführer Sepp Dietrich in the north, and the 5th Panzer Army under General Hasso von Manteuffel in the center. The German plan is Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, and it calls for the armoured spearheads to cross the Meuse River within 2 days, reach Antwerp within a week, and sever the Allied supply lines in a stroke that Hitler believes will force a negotiated peace before the Soviet offensive in the east becomes irreversible. The German commanders who brief the plan to their unit, commanders, know the timeline is optimistic. They know the fuel is insufficient for the full drive. They know the Allied air forces will be devastating once the weather clears. What they do not know, what no intelligence assessment available to OB West has adequately calculated, is what happens when American soldiers, who have been told that the situation is hopeless, decide not to believe it. What happens is the Battle of the Bulge, and what defines it from beginning to end is not the German offensive's operational brilliance or the Allied command's eventual response. Though both of those things are worth examining, it is the specific and stubborn refusal, at every level of the American military, from private to general, to accept that the tactical situation requires withdrawal when the tactical situation objectively does require withdrawal. The Germans would describe this quality in their post-battle assessments with a word that does not translate cleanly, but that German commanders used repeatedly in their accounts of the fighting. Unerklärlich, inexplicable. They meant it as an analytical term, not an insult. They were describing a behavioral pattern in their opponent that their operational planning had not predicted, and that their post-battle analysis could not fully account for within the framework of military rationality that German staff education had built. An army that refused to withdraw from tactically untenable positions was not, by German military doctrine, displaying courage. It was displaying irrationality, a failure to apply the professional military logic that requires a commander to trade space for time and preserve his force for future fighting, rather than consuming it in a position that cannot be held. The German commanders who filed these assessments were correct that the behavior they were describing was inconsistent with German military doctrine. They were wrong that it was irrational. What it was, what the American soldier in the Ardennes in December 1944 was demonstrating in ways that the German operational framework could not accommodate, was a different kind of military calculation, built on different assumptions about what the loss of a position means and what the holding of it costs the enemy. And it was a calculation that proved, in the specific conditions of the Battle of the Bulge, to be more correct than the German one. The American army that held the Ardennes line in December 1944 was not, by any standard military metric, the army best suited to absorb a major offensive without catastrophic failure. The 8th Corps had been placed in the Ardennes, specifically because it was considered a quiet sector, a position where battered divisions could rest and be rebuilt, where green divisions could be introduced to frontline conditions without the immediate pressure of a major enemy operation, and where the demands on the Allied supply system could be managed below the level required for active offensive operations. The logic was sound by the standards of the intelligence picture available to General Troy Middleton's 8th Corps headquarters in early December 1944. The Ardennes in winter had been considered unpassable for major armoured operations since 1940, when Germany had proven that assessment catastrophically wrong by driving exactly this route to encircle the French and British forces in Belgium. The American command had that precedent available, the failure to weight it appropriately, the specific intelligence failure that allowed the Ardennes offensive to achieve total tactical surprise, is a separate subject whose causes the post-war investigations examined at length. What matters for the story of the battle's outcome is not that the surprise was achieved, but what the men who were surprised did next. The logic of the sector assignment was sound. The Ardennes in winter had been considered unpassable for major armoured operations since 1940, when Germany had proven that assessment catastrophically wrong, and the American intelligence community had apparently not fully internalized that precedent when evaluating the current threat. The men in the foxholes along the Ghost Front, as American soldiers had taken to calling the quiet Ardennes line, were experienced enough to be dangerous in a defensive fight, but exhausted enough to be vulnerable to the specific shock effect of a massive, unexpected offensive in the pre-dawn darkness. When the German artillery opened on December 16th, the companies along the front did exactly what men who have been shelled without warning tend to do in the first minutes. They got down, absorbed the shock, waited for the barrage to lift, and then looked up to see what was coming. What was coming across the snow-covered fields and through the fir forests that gave the German armor the concealment to approach without being detected until it was almost on top of the American positions, was something that the American army had not encountered in this form since the German offensive of 1918, a force large enough to go around, through, and past the forward positions without stopping to reduce them, leaving American units surrounded and cut off in positions that German doctrine said should now be abandoned to avoid capture. The German commanders who planned and executed the initial breakthrough expected American units to withdraw when encirclement became likely. This was not an unreasonable expectation. It was, in fact, the tactically correct response to encirclement by a superior force when the encircled unit has no prospect of relief in a time frame that allows it to remain combat effective. German military doctrine, the same doctrine that had been refined through 5 years of war on multiple fronts against opponents who included the Red Army at its most determined, prescribed withdrawal from untenable positions as a professional military obligation because a unit that allows itself to be destroyed in a position it cannot hold is a unit that cannot fight again. The German commanders expected the Americans to apply the same logic. The Americans, for reasons that the German post-battle assessments describe as militarily irrational and that the historical record describes as the specific and distinctive product of American military culture in the autumn of 1944, frequently did not. They stayed. They held. They fought in positions that were tactically surrounded, that had no immediate prospect of relief, with ammunition states that should have compelled withdrawal and supply situations that should have compelled surrender, and they held those positions with a tenacity that disrupted the German operational timetable in ways that ultimately decided the battle. The question of why, what it was in the specific institutional and cultural formation of the American soldier of December 1944 that produced this refusal to accept the tactical logic that said, "Get out," is the question that the German commanders never fully answered in their assessments, and that historians have been examining ever since. December 16th, 1944. The 99th Infantry Division, under Major General Walter Robertson, holds the northern shoulder of the Ardennes front in the twin villages of Rocherath and Krinkelt, a position that the 6th Panzer Army's advance must pass through to reach the Elsenborn Ridge beyond it, and that the Elsenborn Ridge must be held to protect the northern shoulder of the penetration that Dietrich's army is trying to drive. The 2nd Infantry Division, which has been attacking north through the 99th sector toward the Roer River dams when the offensive begins, turns around and moves to support the 99th in holding Rocherath-Krinkelt. What follows in those two villages from December 17th to December 19th is one of the most brutal infantry engagements of the entire European campaign. German armor and infantry attacking through streets so narrow that tanks cannot maneuver and must advance in column. American infantry fighting from buildings and rubble piles with bazookas and grenades at ranges measured in feet. The fighting so close and so continuous that wounded men are being treated in the same rooms where other men are fighting the enemy through the windows, where the distinction between the front line and the aid station is the interior wall of a Belgian farmhouse. The 3rd Battalion, 23rd Infantry, under Lieutenant Colonel Paul Tuttle, holds the crossroads at the center of Krinkelt against attacks by the 12th SS Panzer Division. Hitlerjugend, the formation recruited from the Hitler Youth and trained to the hardest standard the SS could apply, one of the most combat-experienced and most fanatically committed formations in the German army. For 36 hours, losing more than 40% of its strength and refusing to withdraw from a position that the 12th SS's commanders assess as indefensible by any conventional military analysis. The 12th SS attacks with armor, with Panzer Grenadiers following the tanks into the village streets, with artillery firing directly at building walls to collapse them onto the defenders inside, with the specific combined arms precision that makes the Waffen-SS divisions qualitatively different from standard Wehrmacht formations in close-terrain fighting. The men of the 3rd Battalion fight back with bazookas fired at tank treads from the windows of stone buildings that are simultaneously being demolished by the tank's gun, with grenades thrown into the gaps that the tanks have made in the walls, with small arms fire directed at the Panzer Grenadiers following the tanks in the narrow streets where the combination of armor and infantry is supposed to be unstoppable. Some of the men fighting in those buildings have been awake for 60 hours. Some are wounded and fighting. Some are fighting in rooms adjacent to rooms where their dead are lying, in positions that have no clear line of authority because the officers and NCOs who held that authority are casualties. In the specific condition of late battle infantry combat, where individual soldiers are making decisions that their training programmed them to make, without waiting for orders that may never come from men who may no longer be alive to give them. The men fighting in those buildings have been in contact for 48 hours without sleep. They are cold in a way that the human body begins to experience, not as a temperature, but as a fundamental alteration of its operating condition. Fingers that cannot properly grip, feet that have stopped transmitting accurate sensation, faces so stiff with cold that the expression of pain requires effort that combat does not permit. They are fighting in this state. The Germans are attacking in this state too, and the German soldiers are equally cold, equally exhausted, equally at the limit of what their bodies can physically sustain. The difference is that the Germans have been told, by an operational plan whose assumptions they have absorbed, that the Americans in these positions will eventually withdraw. The Americans have been told nothing of the kind. Nobody has told them their position is untenable. Nobody has ordered them to retreat. And in the absence of that order, they fight. By December 17th, the Kampfgruppe Peiper, the armored spearhead of the 1st SS Panzer Division, 60-plus tanks under SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper, has bypassed Roscherath-Krinkelt to the south and is driving west at a speed that the German operational timetable requires, pushing through the Stavelot and toward the Meuse. Peiper's route takes him through the American supply area that the Ardennes had been, past fuel dumps and ammunition depots and the rear echelon facilities of an army that had been positioned for offensive operations east and was now facing an enemy that had appeared in the west. At Stavelot, on December 18th, Peiper's tanks are within hours of a fuel dump containing approximately 2.2 million gallons of American gasoline. Fuel that would solve the 1st SS Panzer Division's supply problem for the remainder of the offensive. What stops him is a scratch force, engineers, military police, cooks, and clerks who have been organized into a defensive position by officers whose job descriptions do not include forming combat units under fire, but who have done so anyway, because the American officer culture of December 1944 has a specific and consistent response to a situation where no one with the appropriate authority is available to organize a defense. You organize it yourself, with what you have, because the alternative is leaving the road open. The scratch force at Stavelot does not stop Peiper permanently, but it slows him for 18 hours. 18 hours during which the 82nd Airborne Division, under Major General James Gavin, is moving north to block the route. 18 hours that the German operational timetable cannot absorb, and that begin in the process by which Kampfgruppe Peiper, the tip of the spear, the formation on which the entire northern axis of the offensive depends, is isolated and eventually destroyed. The cooks and clerks at Stavelot have not read the operational plan. They have no idea that the fuel dump they are defending is the difference between a German advance that reaches the Meuse and one that runs out of fuel 40 miles short of it. They know that there are enemy tanks on the road and that someone has to slow them down. They slow them down. December 19th, 1944. The 106th Infantry Division has been on the front for 5 days. Most of its regiments, the 422nd and 423rd Infantry Regiments, approximately 8,000 men, encircled on the Schnee-Eifel Plateau by German forces that have bypassed them on both flanks. The encirclement is complete. The supply situation is critical. The division arrived in the Ardennes without adequate ammunition reserves, and the 5 days of defensive fighting have consumed most of what it had. General Alan Jones, commanding the 106th, requests permission from Middleton's 8th Corps to withdraw before the encirclement is complete. The request is denied. The regiments are told to hold and await relief. The relief does not come in time. By December 19th, approximately 7,000 men of the 422nd and 423rd Infantry Regiments, the largest American surrender since Bataan, are in German captivity. The 106th Division's breakdown is, by the standards of the Bulge, an exception. The specific and catastrophic combination of inexperience, inadequate supply, and the particular devastation of the Schnee-Eifel terrain produces an outcome that the German military expected to repeat across the entire front, and that, in the rest of the American defensive line, does not repeat. The 106th's failure is real and is not diminished by the context. The context is that every other American unit in the path of the German offensive absorbs the same shock, faces comparable encirclement, receives the same inadequate supply, and does not break. Understanding why requires looking at the units that held rather than the one that didn't. The 7th Armored Division under Brigadier General Robert Hasbrouck arrives at Saint-Vith on December the 17th under conditions that define the operational crisis perfectly. Saint-Vith is a road junction whose capture by the Germans would open the entire center of the American defensive front to rapid exploitation. The 7th Armored is moving south against the flow of the retreating units, against the traffic of the American rear area in full retreat from what every visual indicator suggests is a collapsing front, through roads clogged with vehicles moving in every direction, commanded by a general who has not had a clear operational brief because the 8th Corps headquarters has been moving under German pressure and the communication system that should be providing clarity is providing fragments. Hasbrouck establishes a defensive line around Saint-Vith, using units that are arriving piecemeal, in conditions where he cannot know what the full German strength opposing him is, and holds it for 5 days against attacks by the 18th Volksgrenadier Division, the Führer-Begleit Brigade, and elements of multiple armored formations that the German plan has designated for a rapid advance through Saint-Vith and beyond. By December 22nd, the Saint-Vith salient, the horseshoe-shaped defensive perimeter that Hasbrouck's division and attached units have created in the middle of what should be the German main avenue of advance, a perimeter held by the 7th Armored Division, the 9th Armored Division's CCB, the remnants of the 106th Division's 424th Infantry Regiment under Colonel Alexander Reed, and assorted attached units whose combined strength barely justifies the word perimeter, is taking fire from 3 sides simultaneously. Its defenders are exhausted, past the point where the Army's own operational doctrine prescribes relief or withdrawal. The 7th Armored has been in continuous combat for 6 days. Its tank crews have not slept in periods longer than 90 minutes since December 17th. Its infantry has been fighting in temperatures that the meteorological records of the period identify as among the lowest recorded in the Belgian Ardennes in 20 years, in positions that were never designed for sustained defensive combat, in a supply situation where ammunition is rationed and food is what individual soldiers, carried into position with them, and have been consuming without resupply since the encirclement began to form. The German commanders, observing the Saint-Vith salient from their operational maps, can see all of this. Their intelligence is accurate. Their assessment of the salient's sustainability is accurate. Their prediction of when it will break is inaccurate, not because the men inside it are receiving support, they are not, but because the men inside it are deciding not to break on the schedule the German assessment prescribes. German General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, sends messages through command channels suggesting that the American garrison should be offered the chance to surrender with honor. The message reflects Manteuffel's genuine respect for the defense his forces are encountering and his accurate assessment that the men holding Saint-Vith have done what military professionalism requires of a soldier. They have held a position that needed to be held against a force that by rights should have taken it. The message also reflects Manteuffel's genuine bafflement. The Saint-Vith garrison's position, by every measure his staff can calculate, should have broken days ago. The near failure that comes closest to collapsing the entire American defensive effort in the Ardennes arrives not in a single dramatic engagement, but in the cumulative weight of 5 days of continuous combat, encirclement, supply failure, and the specific psychological pressure of fighting a battle whose outcome no commander at any level can see clearly. The 28th Infantry Division, which has been holding the center of the German advance south of the Schnee-Eifel, is the formation that pays most completely for its position in the path of the main German effort. The 28th's 3 infantry regiments are overrun, encircled, bypassed, and reduced to fractions of their combat strength in the first 4 days of the offensive. The 110th Infantry Regiment, under Colonel Hurley Fuller, holds the center of the division's line directly in the path of Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army's main effort, with individual companies defending villages that the German operational plan requires to be taken in hours, not days. Company B of the 110th, approximately 100 men, holds the village of Hussingen for 2 full days against the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, a division that outnumbers the single American company by a factor that military doctrine does not provide a meaningful way to describe, without simply noting that companies do not hold villages against divisions and that the men of Company B are apparently unaware of this convention. They hold Hosingen until their ammunition is exhausted and their position is physically overrun, costing the 26th Volksgrenadier 2 full days of its operational timeline and delaying the armored formations waiting behind it for the same period. 2 days. In the arithmetic of the Bulge, 2 days is the difference between a German advance that reaches the Meuse and one that does not. But the regiments are not destroyed as organized units. They conduct a fighting withdrawal that costs the German forces advancing through their sector the days they cannot afford to spend. Days during which Bastogne is reinforced, during which the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions are moving northeast and southeast from their assembly areas in France, during which the German operational timetable loses the margin it needs to reach the Meuse before American reserves arrive. The 28th Division is broken. It is not beaten. The distinction is one that German military doctrine recognized and that German after-action assessments consistently noted across the battle. A unit that continues to fight while being destroyed is a unit that has not conceded defeat, and a unit that has not conceded defeat continues to impose costs that affect the operational calculus even when its own survival is no longer likely. The German commanders at every level of the Ardennes offensive filed after-action assessments that are remarkable for their consistency. They describe a battle that began as they had planned and ended in failure, that they had not predicted, and the explanation they consistently identify is not Allied material superiority. The German forces had been told that the battle would be decided before Allied air power could be effectively employed, and for the first 4 days it was. The explanation is not Allied tactical skill. The initial German penetrations were achieved against American units that were surprised, outmatched in numbers, and fighting in conditions where tactical skill alone could not compensate for the imbalance. The explanation they identify, with a consistency that spans the accounts from Dietrich in the north to Manteuffel in the center to Brandenberger in the south, is a specific quality of American defensive resistance that their operational planning had not adequately weighted. American units that should have withdrawn did not withdraw. American units that should have collapsed did not collapse. American units that were tactically in positions that their own doctrine rated as untenable continued to fight from those positions, at cost to themselves that German tactical analysis rated as irrational, and that cost the German offensive the days and hours and kilometers that it needed to succeed. Manteuffel's post-war account, produced in the Operational History Reviews that the United States Army's Historical Division conducted with captured German generals in 1945 and 1946. The same series of interviews that produced the assessments of pattern, of the supply chain, of every aspect of American military performance that the German command had observed and attempted to analyze, identifies the American refusal to yield at Saint-Vith, at Rocherath-Krinkelt, at the crossroads that were not on any operational map, but that were defended by men who had decided that the crossroads was where the defense would be made, as the specific operational factor that decided the battle. Dietrich, whose 6th Panzer Army had the primary responsibility for the northern shoulder of the offensive, the shoulder that was supposed to drive past the Elsenborn Ridge and sweep northwest to Liège, is even more direct. His post-war assessment, which the Army's historians preserve in the Bericht series of captured German documents, attributes the failure of the 6th Panzer Army's mission not to Allied air power, which he notes was grounded by weather for the first 4 days, and therefore irrelevant to the initial failure, and not to logistical insufficiency, which he acknowledges but rates as a secondary factor. He attributes it to the 99th Infantry Division and the 2nd Infantry Division on the Elsenborn Ridge, to the men of those divisions who held the northern shoulder against formations that his assessment rates as objectively superior and who held it long enough for the operational situation to become irreversible. His account does not express surprise that the Americans fought well. His account expresses something closer to bafflement that they fought at all in positions where, by the German Army's professional judgment, fighting to the last round rather than withdrawing served no purpose that a rational military calculation could identify. He did not understand that the American soldiers in those positions were not making a rational military calculation. They were honoring a commitment to each other that preceded any tactical calculation, and that commitment, the specific social bond between American soldiers that every study of American military cohesion in the Second World War identifies as the primary driver of combat effectiveness, was not a factor that German military planning had developed a framework to model. Not the air power that arrived when the weather cleared, not Patton's Third Army relief of Bastogne, not Eisenhower's decision to reinforce the shoulders of the penetration, rather than attempt to close the gap at its base. Those things mattered, they all mattered, but they mattered because the American line did not break in the first 72 hours, and the American line did not break in the first 72 hours because the men in it refused to leave when the operational logic said, leave. By the time the Battle of the Bulge ended in late January 1945, when the last German forces were pushed back to approximately the line they had held on December 16th, the human cost on both sides had been enormous. American casualties totaled approximately 75,000, killed, wounded, and missing, the largest single engagement casualty total the United States Army would sustain in the European theater. German casualties were comparable in magnitude, approximately 60,000 to 100,000 killed and wounded, plus irreplaceable tank and vehicle losses and the consumption of the fuel and ammunition reserves that the German war economy could not replace before the Soviet winter offensive began in January 1945. The battle's strategic consequence was not the German defeat of a tactical plan that had been logistically insufficient from its inception. It was the completion of Germany's strategic exhaustion in the West at precisely the moment when the East was about to demand everything Germany had left. The Ardennes offensive consumed the last mobile reserve the German army possessed in the West. When it failed, stopped by American soldiers, who refused to accept the tactical logic that said a position was untenable, there was nothing left to stop what came next. The German commanders who tried to explain what had happened to them in the Ardennes in December 1944 were, in most cases, men who had studied war at a professional level for decades and who had commanded in combat from Poland to France to the Soviet Union. They had seen armies collapse and armies hold. They had experience with the specific phenomenon of a force fighting past the point where military rationality prescribed withdrawal, because the German army itself had done exactly that in the Soviet Union in 1943 and 1944. And they had a framework for understanding that phenomenon when it appeared in German formations. It was the product of National Socialist conviction, of ideological conditioning, of the specific political education that the SS and the Wehrmacht's political officers had been building into German soldiers since 1933. They had a framework for the ideologically motivated resistance, What they did not have was a framework for the specific kind of resistance they encountered at Rocherath Krinkels and St. Vith and 100 other positions across the Ardennes front, because that resistance was not ideological. It was not the product of political conviction or the fear of political consequences for failure. It was the product of something that American military culture had built into its soldiers over years of training and months of combat. A specific relationship with the men beside them that created an obligation stronger than any institutional pressure, and an obligation to that obligation that made the question of whether to stay or withdraw not a military calculation, but a personal one. The German commanders who encountered this quality described it as inexplicable, because it did not fit their model of what made soldiers fight. They were not men who were easily baffled, but the specific quality they encountered in the American soldiers holding the Ardennes line in December 1944, the quality that Manteuffel and Dietrich and every other senior German officer who examined the battle consistently identified as the factor they had not adequately predicted, is a quality that defies the kind of military analysis that weighs force ratios and supply states and tactical position. It is a quality that exists in the space between what a soldier's rational calculation tells him to do and what he does anyway, and it is a quality that the American Army of December 1944 possessed in a form that the German operational planning of October 1944 had not measured and could not have measured, because the instruments of military analysis are built to measure things that are measurable, and the specific quality of a man who has decided to hold a position that should not be held is not among them. The German commanders were stunned. They had a right to be. What they encountered in the Ardennes was not superior firepower, or superior generalship, or superior logistics, though all of those things eventually contributed to the German defeat. What they encountered first, what stopped the German advance before any of those other factors could be applied, was something older and simpler and more fundamental than any of them. Soldiers who had decided that the ground they were standing on was worth more than the military logic that told them to give it up, and who were correct.